Glazing. You've probably heard the term and more likely been terrified at the idea because it's usually in the context of realism giants like Anna Mason. We love her. OMG. But seriously, let's not panic. We're going to paint some tulips today. Lovely, simple, classic tulips. And I'm going to talk about glazing the Christie way. Let's do this. I'm going to put down a little bit of color. Whatever you got, just spread it out on a piece of paper and we're going to let it dry for a moment, rinse our brush, and then we're going to choose another color and do that again. And your first color's drying while your second color's going down, and we're going to add a third color. And yeah, we're going to actually force them to dry because that's kind of the thing with glazing. It takes a lot of patience. Let's then, on the dry colors, put a little bit of a second color. There you have it. That's glazing. Let's give credit where credit is due. Glazing is traditionally an oil painting technique that consists of a lot of thin layers of oil paint. Watercolor artists have adapted it to their medium, and you know me, I've adapted and readapted and unadapted and adapted it again, and here we are. Whew. Welcome to glazing Christie style. Here's an important point. I didn't wait too long for that underlayer to dry. The base layer of paint, the red, the green, and the purple. I really didn't. And it makes a difference because when you add that glazing layer, it disrupts and moistens and all the things underneath. And you get kind of a blurriness where the two overlap. So here's where patience comes into play. This is the same collection of swatches, but I've let them dry 24 hours. And you can see in some of the combinations, the glazing layer is a lot more crisp and clean. It doesn't drag any of the underpainting layer with it, the base layer. So just like an oil painter would need to let the layers cure, sometimes for days, weeks, or even months on end before they could glaze again. Now we're lucky. We don't gotta wait weeks and months. We have to wait maybe overnight, maybe a handful of hours, but patience really pays off. All right, exercise number 2 for glazing. But first, we are going to be painting tulips soon. 2 different tulips. One where I really let the layers dry in between, and one where I don't, so we can see the difference. All right, we're going to make a chart. I love charts. There are 3 different techniques that I use for glazing. It's kind of how I wrap my head around the idea. I'm not saying these are the classic, perfect, only way to glaze, but this is how I think about it. We've got shading, we've got color, we've got detail. I'm going to create the same red flowers in each quadrant. And let me show you how this works. Glazing for adding shadows. Mix up a darker color, and you're going to start to layer it onto your dry underpainting. Base layer, whatever you want to call it. You're thinking about your low areas, your darker areas of the flower, the landscape, whatever it is. And you're trying to think about the color of the underpainting and the new color you're adding and what the 2 overlapped will make in terms of a new color. Glazing for adding color. Same kind of idea. In this case though, I love to think about actually using more bigger sweeping strokes where I'm really covering up almost all of the underpainting to really get a slow but rich layering of colors. And glazing for detail. So in this case, you're thinking about the finer details. This is happening towards the end of a painting where you're really slowly been building up shadows, you've been lifting for highlights, and now you want to really get that punch and that pop off the page with the fine little details. And you're adding second, third, fourth plus colors on top of a base layer. And depending on which order you use these in, because if I forgot to mention, there's no order to these. You can start with the detail, you can start with the color for glazing, you can start with the shading and mix it all up. But depending on the order, you're going to get different effects. If your mind is a little bit blown or spinning at this point, I want you to head into comments and let me know what your number 1 question is at this point. Next up, we have the sketch. The first of the 2 tulips I'm going to work on, I'm going to sketch out in more detail. The second, I'm not going to sketch at all. Now I've got my handy dandy iPad to show you. I'm starting with a simple circle and then a teardrop overlapped, and I'm just mapping out the basic curve of the stem. getting a feel for how wide the base of the tulip head should be, where I want that leaf to be and curl. This is so nice to just kind of get a little workout in before you dive into the real thing. Warm up workout, you know what I mean. All right, let's get to it. No more waiting around. When I think of glazing, I think of a more realistic piece. And so when I start using glazing specifically and get really persnickety about letting my layers dry in between, it's because I want a more realistic vibe overall. You may have been wondering as you were watching the second exercise, the one with the 3 red flowers, Christy, isn't that just wet on dry? Here's the thing. Yes, essentially, but with glazing, the dry is really dry. Because if it's not, everything's going to start to smudge and blend together. So with glazing, you get a certain crispness because you've let each layer dry for longer. And it really makes a difference. We'll see. Starting off by adding color. I'm just mapping out the basic colors, yellows, greens. I'm staying light on purpose. Here's a little bit of red. I am, even from the get-go, following the curve or the silhouette of the sketch that I've already laid down. You see me there already adding a little bit of darkness, that burgundy watercolor. I'm mapping out darker greens in areas slowly. Okay, this is our first layer, friends. Soon we're gonna let her dry. Yep, about 24 hours later, let's see what we've got. I'm laying down a stroke with a little bit of green in it confidently, knowing that my base layer is not going to be disrupted. Gorgeous. Little darker green on the stem, bringing it up into the base of the tulip a little bit. Switching to red, I've cleaned my brush in between. Friends, I'll tell you what, I'm not a big brush cleaner, but when it comes to glazing, I do tend to rinse my brush a whole lot more. Adding some of that detail glazing here already with the tip of my 1/2-inch dagger. Grabbing some darker greens and making some more decisive strokes along that big curving leaf, adding some all over color to the top of that leaf's curve there to continue to mold that form. And then if it's too much, just lift it back out with a clean, damp brush. I'm using a really limited palette here, so when I say I'm using a dark green, I'm adding a little bit of red or blue, maybe sometimes purple to it. You do you. That dark green, I'm going to start adding some glazing for shading right here in between where the leaves are intersecting one another and on that stem. And a big sweeping motion there with a little bit of, fluorescent yellow, love it, and then a little bit of a emerald green on the edge. Again, that is adding glazing for color, because I really didn't change the form of the leaf when I added those 2 colors, the fluorescent yellow and the green. I just changed the color of the leaf. Getting in here back into the tulip with some more red and even a little bit of red in that curving leaf. Can you tell I'm obsessed with that leaf? Notice I did a little bit of lifting there as I was explaining my last move. And friends, just something to note, when you've let your base layer dry, each layer dry on its own, that layer is going to be more resistant to lifting. If you're wondering about some of these other techniques like lifting, I have a whole beginner watercolor course. I'm going to link it below. Check it out. I hope you're having so much fun, and if you are, give this video a boop. That's a like. Now we're about 12 hours later, and I'm going to start adding more layers. Remember, friends, you can be adding glazing for shadows, glazing to add additional color, or glazing to add details, and that can happen at any time in any order. So right now I'm adding a little bit of shadow with a brighter red, a little bit of a touch of detail down the middle along that wet edge where it meets the dry edge, and that's creating a really nice little bump in the tulip, creating that shape. Going back to where the tulip's just starting to open and adding some more purple mixed with a little bit of red, and glazing on some additional yellows and greens coming up from the stem. I love how things are not blending together because everything has been drying for a long time in between layers. So when I put a green a little bit on top of a red, even with a little friction, they're not mixing together because the red underneath is cured. And finally, a nice strong shadow there along that tall leaf, and a little bit of dark blue mixed with purple and red at the tip of the tulip. Let's get into tulip number 2. Remember, this one I'm not sketching, and I'm also gonna speed up the drying, not gonna do the whole 24-hour, 12-hour drying thing. Laying down some fluorescent yellow and a little bit of red at the same time to start to create that bulbous shape of the tulip head. This is nearly what I'd call damp on dry, a version of the wet on dry technique. And if you want to know more about water control, you need to check out the video in the links below. It's a good one. I'm adding some leaves in, and I am definitely thinking back to my sketch of the first tulip to let it inform the strokes that I'm making. Adding some red here back into the tulip, getting pretty strong right away. Now, I want my yellow tulip to dry a bit, so I'm going to go back to my red tulip and continue to glaze on there. At this stage in the red tulip, it's a lot about adding smaller details. So I'm using a lot of the tip of my 1/4-inch dagger brush, and then of course my liner brush, super helpful at this point. If you look closely, tulips have the most gorgeous, tiny little linear details going on every which way in every petal. But if you look close, those little striations and lines are defining the shape and the volume of the tulip. So take a little time to study all those little moments in your tulip and recreate a few on your painting. While I am definitely mixing on my palette way more than I normally do, I'm not being too precious about it. I've got a lot of red down there. I'll put a little blue in if I want a darker red, a little purple maybe, even sometimes a little brown. This is a limited palette, so I'm working with what I've got. Concentrating a lot here where these two parts of the tulip meet, where they're starting to bloom and open up, creating a lot of darkness and detail in there, because I really want that tulip seam, I guess that's something we can call it, to pop. Going back to the yellow tulip, and I'm going to be honest, she's only been drying for about 5 minutes of real time. And you can already see how, as I lay down the red, it quickly becomes an orange because the yellow underneath isn't cured and it's being disturbed and mixing together with the red. So I'm going to give it a little more time, go back to some detailing in the red tulip. I'm trying to get those gorgeous velvety depth shades of color that I seem to be able to get with my red tulip with my yellow one, and I'm just getting a lot of orange. And so I definitely can sense that it's time for a break. I need to give this bad boy a little bit more time to dry. Okay, so I'm going to force this dry a little bit. I'm going to give it about a half hour. I've also used a little bit of the air gun with some heat to really speed things along. And I'm going to go in hard with some gorgeous detail along the contour of the front-facing petal of this tulip with a brighter red. And I can already sense that I'm not disturbing the underneath part as much as I was before. So I can really start cutting in. So this is glazing for detail for sure. A little premature than I would normally go in with this type of style of painting, but I'm feeling a need to redeem myself here. And so bringing in a mixture that has a little blue and green and brown, I'm just basically have created a really dark color so I can start to notch out some of those details behind that main petal to start to give this bad boy some depth. While I'm at it with my liner brush, with what paint I already have on it, I'm going to edit the shape of this tulip from underneath a little bit just to perfect things. And I'm going to scrub along the side of that front petal with some yellow just to add some fun texture. And then start to cut in with a darker yellow and my round brush on the underside here on the right. I really want that front tulip petal, the widest, most visible petal, to come forward and everything else start to go backwards. But again, I'm starting to feel the effects of not letting this dry or cure for an extended amount of time. I'm trying to glaze over that darker yellow, and I'm really just getting a yellow that's not as dark as I want because it's mixing with the uncured yellow underneath. What I'm discovering is that I can easily add details simple and clean and crisp with my liner brush when things are reasonably dry and not cured. But the glazing, where I want to add big sweeping strokes, even with a slightly larger brush like a #2 round compared to the liner, becomes really difficult and things get what I call smudgy. Everything just starts blending together. So honestly, with glazing, I know I'm free-spirited, I'm a fast and loose painter, but when it comes to glazing, patience is gold. I actually find incredible satisfaction in challenging myself with more realistic endeavors in my painting. But what I will suggest, if you're impatient like me, is when you're working on a painting that requires a lot of glazing and a lot of dry time in between layers, just have some other paintings going. Have fun with it, so you'll have something to work on in the in-between. Well, I am really digging into the detail and the glazing that I can add, really notching out that gorgeous center line on that front petal with my liner brush, bringing in some really nice opaque yellow here for some highlights. And I know what my limitations are now that I haven't let each of these layers dry fully, and so I'm sticking to what is going to work at this point, and the detailing is working for sure. We've had a really good time covering one specific technique in a lot of detail. But friends, there are a bunch of other basic techniques that I've put my own spin on that you need to learn next. Watch this playlist and let's get into it. Happy painting.